there were Labour councillors I could work with, do business with, who I disagreed on point, and sometimes they'll be right, sometimes they won't be. And not changing your priority every week. If every week I have a new priority, I have no priorities at all. Waving a placard or having a go. It's those months or two before, it's building the case, it's showing the evidence. What would you do about it as well? What would you suggest to the decision maker? In early 2022, when myself and Pretty were still in office, we set up a review of the skilled worker visa because we knew things like the salary thresholds were due to be updated and there were going to be some changes in the latter part of that. Take a brave decision on social care that they'll probably see the benefit of in about 10, 15 years time. People in their 40s like me will see the most benefit if we finally resolve these social care issues that are there. But that's not really it. So I think this is the one where the care sector can say, okay.
What would you say to government to actually transform the social care sector?
The Commission should not be reporting in 2028. It should be reporting as soon as it and take on the discussion about the long-term future of social care, because in reality, immigration cannot be a crutch for a long-term problem.
Hello and welcome to today's podcast where we talk to Kevin Foster, who is the ex-Transportation Minister, and we talk about all things in regards to immigration and the changing policies which are affecting the social care. Enjoy. Amazing. Yeah, so really interesting to understand how you got into politics. Why did you choose that route?
What got me into politics? I think it was the issues. It was interests. So I was growing up in a family that did not have political involvement. My dad was a labourer painter at Devonport Dockyard. My mum was a classroom assistant at a primary school. So we weren't a political family.
Yeah.
But it was things of wondering, who makes these decisions? Seeing things on the news. And also, I think the final thing that actually got me involved in the particular Conservative Party was a sense that something was unfair. And I'll tell you what it was. My local Labour council decided to scrap subsidised bus fares for those aged 16 and 17 going to their sixth form to do A-levels, but then introduced free bus travel to go to a local college to do skills courses. Now, that in itself seemed a little bit odd, but what really got me was the attitude. My local Labour councillor tried to defend it to me as something to do with basically wealthy people go and do A-levels and go on to university, whereas people like us, i.e. knowing my dad's background, we just go off to the college to do skills courses. Well, safe to say I wasn't very impressed with that attitude at all. And here I am 30 years later.
But you actually went to speak to the people that enforce those policies, which a lot of people wouldn't do.
No, a lot of people wouldn't do.
So why did you think, I'm actually going to speak to the people that enforce this because they need to be held responsible for it? Well, that's a very interesting attitude.
Partly because I'd seen, read the newspapers, I'd knew who the local MP was, realised who and it was curious. I was curious about things. People found it strange that I would go and speak to my MP or go and speak to my councillor. But do you know what? If you're 16, 17, 18, and you've got an issue, get in touch with your representatives. It's important people hear from you, not just the people who show up to a residents' meeting or might be more widely involved in things. Actually, and from experience and having done it myself, most will be delighted to hear from a younger constituent, even if it's something that you disagree with them on. They'll be pleased to see your involvement.
Interesting.
Just be polite.
Yeah. And be inquisitive as well. And that's really.
And also be prepared to listen if they have got a good argument.
Yeah, of course. Why do they make those changes? But if you see those inequalities, it's for you to then actually say, I don't think I agree with that. How did you get started then? So you see these injustices, you want to make a change. Where did you start and how did that lead you to become immigration minister, things like that?
I think a lot of people, regardless of the political party they got involved with, will probably have a story about being out on some campaign day delivering a leaflet. Till if you're starting off in your teenage years or early 20s, a lot of political parties will think, oh, whoopee, fresh legs, fresh pair of legs. Doesn't matter which political party you join, they'll be delighted to see you walking in the door when there's a campaign day on for that reason. So, look, a lot of things. It sort of happened alongside I was doing university studies and other things as well. So, this wasn't a full-time thing. Got to know people, got involved, went up to the Midlands where I was at Warwick University, got to know people there. That's where I met Hazel, who became a ward colleague on the council, now Mrs. Foster. It was our 8th wedding anniversary yesterday. So it just sort of developed. I then ended up on the council, in Coventry City Council, 6-year period when the Conservative Party controlled the council, and did the finance brief for 2 years, which certainly brings to the fore all the issues with social care, both in terms of adults and children's social care. But also the actual business of representing people, of making decisions. And there's something very different about making decisions in an elected political environment than perhaps there is having seen decisions made in a business environment. There are different things. And of course, there are services you're providing that some of your customers clearly don't want. So, for example, parking enforcement isn't a service that anyone ever writes in thanking you for a parking ticket.
Thank you for the shit.
Enforcement services, again, people don't write in. And of course, around some areas of care, there can be some real tensions between what is the right outcome, what is in that person's best interests. And there can be a bureaucratic view about potentially moving someone into care or into a care home. There'll be a family view, plus the individual themselves. And, it's very much more complex than just looking at a spreadsheet and seeing what the pounds and pence say.
Interesting. I think it's really interesting as well to look at how did your view of decision making change, actually being behind the scenes in local government and then central government. So what experiences have you had that changed or influenced your view on local central government?
I think what changed my perception is, once you actually are in representative politics, you actually realise that yes, you have opponents, but you don't have enemies. There'll be the odd person who takes their politics personally, has very little to offer. And that'll be in all political parties. But in reality, there were Labour councillors I could work with and do business with who I disagreed on points, and we'd have quite some arguments. But you recognise actually they want the same objective. They're just coming at it from a different perspective. And sometimes they'll be right, sometimes they won't be. But again, you see that representation there. You also see that certainly at Westminster, where I used to get on fairly well with my respective shadows. There was one particularly, Holly Lynch, who was excellent. She was very good. Obviously, we'd throw a sort of verbal rock at each other over the dispatch box, but generally, I could see where she was coming from, the tradition, what she saw as her priorities from a Labour perspective. But I think where you see is then that interface with professional officers or civil servants. So I was lucky when I was finance cabinet member in Coventry to have a chap called Chris West, who was director of finance at Coventry at that time, who was very good. He'd set something out, then hear your feedback, you'd think and recognise that, you're coming at it from a, I'm not here to represent the authority. I'm here to represent the public within the authority. It's very easy to get very technical, become very native. But simply, you should try and understand what's being presented. You shouldn't just assume you know it all and it's people just not wanting to do what you want them to do. And similarly, in the civil service, you would inevitably find, there's elements at times when, yes, minister comes to mind where, well, minister, yes, but, you could sort of... But actually, most, again, want to do a professional job, want to be part of something successful. And the thing I found, particularly with the teams I work with, was knowing what your priorities are were the most important things, and not changing your priority every week. Because one of my expressions when I used to chair ministerial boards was, right, if every week I have a new priority, I have no priorities at all. And we used to make sure things like we followed through on previous decision making, we looked at what the goals are, also trying to look over the horizon, not just at what was in today's newspaper, because things that might be annoying people today, they might have completely forgotten about in 6 months' time, but that big thing you're delivering comes through. And also sometimes it can look like you're turning an oil tanker at times. Local authorities, they used to say it was like turning a big ship. Oh yeah, turning around government can be, particularly on things like immigration, you can feel like you're turning around the biggest ship that's ever existed. But you do build respect. Other people, though, you will hold to account, and you realise that they're not ready to deliver. Then they're doing a job 9 to 5, fine. but they're not really, there's not that real passion and focus there. So that's the sort of things I learned. And also how you influence isn't showing up the day before a decision and waving a placard or having a go. It's those months or two before. It's, it's building the case, it's showing the evidence, and crucially, what would you do about it as well? What would you suggest to the decision maker? They may not agree, but they'll at least give more consideration. Whereas if you're just jumping around and having a go, fine. But that's the politics of protest, not the politics of decision making.
And I think it's a really key point as well, especially when you're thinking about how do you influence decisions. And, to the point of you being 17, 16, looking at, this policy on buses and thinking, this is unjust. Who do I speak to? You're going to have a new generation of people who are trying to make change, and how they approach it can sometimes influence the outcome of what actually happens. From your perspective, having been in local and central government, if you were, leaving school, how would you advise people young to get into politics? How would they do that to influence those decisions?
Well, I think what I'd say is don't necessarily think of it purely as getting into politics. Because yes, there's those who might be very interested and want to join a political party, try and become a councillor or an MP or things. But generally, it can be think about the subjects you care about. What are the things you really drive? What are the things that interest you? Now, that might be a set of causes. So, for example, the environment's been a common or an interesting one. It could be military, if you've got parents in the military, particularly around veteran services. And perhaps get involved with an organisation that isn't political with a big P, but campaigns around those areas. I think a lot of people get involved, for example, with things like the Royal British Legion, because they want to campaign for veterans, rather than they don't particularly want to campaign for a political party in doing that. The Legion is neutral, clearly, to political parties. But get involved, think about things that interest you or that want to make a difference. And it might lead you to working in politics, might lead you to get involved yourself. Think, what is it that interests you and what you're passionate about and what do you enjoy doing? And sometimes perhaps spend a week or two writing down what you enjoy when you've enjoyed doing something and when you haven't enjoyed doing something. Not so much the subject of what you're doing and what you're actually doing. So was it talking to someone? Was it doing a podcast or an interview or doing something on social media? Because that will give you your points to whether, if you want to make a difference, what's the best role for you in doing so.
Interesting. And so how did that lead you to transportation, immigration, stuff like that? How did you get into that lane of government?
Some of it is, of course, it's chosen a bit for you. And I can remember being on the train going up to London just after the general election in 2019 when Boris Johnson phoned me up to say, would I like to go to the Home Office? And I said, right, okay. And the immigration brief, which is known to be one of the most demanding in government. You are not going to please everyone. There's no two ways about that. And it had, a previous minister had lasted 4 months.
Really?
I'd lasted 4 or 5 months, my predecessor. So hadn't been there long. There'd been virtually an annual new immigration minister, which hadn't been helpful. Like with housing, I think if the Conservative Party wants to look at things it needs to deal with, if we were going to go back into government, you need to have longevity and stability in complex briefs like planning and immigration. If you don't, then you've got people who are learning the job constantly. And given the complexity, you struggle to engage with the civil service and with partners. So in terms of, I got the phone call, I thought, okay. And then you start getting this blizzard of briefings. It's amazing how popular you become, all sorts of sectors that, funnily enough, the ones that have got vacancies all want to meet you to discuss how a new visa is going to apparently be the magic solution to all the problems in the world. We then had the pandemic as well. So that took me into there. It was one of those fascinating 3 years working with Pretty and with Tom and the team. And it was, and Chris Philp as well, who's now Shadow Home Secretary. And it was a fascinating, in-depth, casework is phenomenal. The correspondence amount is huge. And I deliberately shifted a lot of it to coming to me personally because we were seeing some appallingly dismissive responses going out internally. And you just, you're absolutely full at it for about 3 years.
So, going back to the visa specific to health and care, why was it created? Like, just starting there, because there's been so much change since. but what was the original hypothesis to bring it in?
Yeah, the original logic, and it's worth remembering that the general skilled worker visa covered a lot of health and care jobs, such as senior care worker, doctor, nurse. There was a lot of rubbish when it was first introduced that nurses wouldn't qualify. That was because a lot of journalists just hadn't bothered reading the details, which unfortunately is a common issue in immigration. I suspect my Seema Malhotra and Yvette Cooper probably now is the times thinking, God, no, that's not the position. Read the detail. But anyway, I'll park that for so we already had quite a number of care roles were covered, and along with ancillary ones like care home manager and other areas. So the theory was, after the pandemic, there was a need to do more recruitment into health and social care. There'd been a wish to exempt health and social care workers from the immigration help surcharge, which had been quite debated, a bit of a political campaign on that one. And also to more quickly process visas through. So it was done as a subset of skilled worker to save having to write a huge amount of new policy. And that was what was then introduced. I'd always been, talking candidly, one of the view that there were issues to solve in the social care sector other than just providing access to immigration, particularly around what are the packages. Because if you've got recruitment difficulties within the country, say to yourself, what if we bring people in on a visa? What happens when they get ILR? Because if the terms and conditions aren't good, or even we've seen some good examples where people come in as a care worker, then get their English to the standards that was working here, that they can then qualify, get to the level to practice as a doctor or a nurse, which is their core qualification, but they've worked as a care worker. That's a positive. But we've also seen trends where people come in as a care worker and then like the domestic population say, well, actually, hang on, I'd qualify for a visa with that firm over there doing something different and earning more. And that's one of the challenges. Immigration can play a part, but there are some wider discussions we need to have about why people aren't taking up vacancies in the health and care sector, and not just see the immigration status being used as the sort of attraction. And then later issues came obviously with the surge around dependence and other things, which clearly pointed towards abuse of the visa.
Interesting. Yeah, and that was going to be kind of the next follow-on question, which is, you have visas being introduced, you have then this massive influx of staff that are then coming into the UK specifically for, care jobs. What did you see that was positive from those visas, and what did you see being the negatives from that?
Well, let's start with the positives. People were able to recruit into vacant posts. Some organisations found it easier to recruit, and not just care workers, but also the other jobs that qualify through. And there's quite a number actually that qualify, provided they're working for like the NHS and other areas. So it did provide some positives there. Where the negatives came was, one, there's clearly been some abuse going on, people setting up fronts and recruiting care workers. It became obvious that there were some examples of modern slavery where people had paid fees to become care workers here, then were not treated well. There's been documented examples of prosecution. And let's remember, modern slavery doesn't just hit the person, it hits legitimate companies as well. We're sat in a social care company. They've then got to try and compete on price with a company that is undercutting them by using appalling practices that cannot be justified. So, it's not just an issue for workers themselves, is also an issue for legitimate care companies. It's why everyone in the care sector should be wanting to absolutely tackle it. We did have examples of modern slaves identified here in Torbay as well. So this isn't just something that happened in London or in the bigger cities, it was across the country. So there were problems with that. I think it did become an issue when you saw there were more dependents than main visa holders. That was virtually unparalleled. So it was right to take action. I think where the issues come with the skilled worker visa is, and people call it the Boris wave, they should actually call it the Rishi wave. Because coming out of the pandemic in early 2022, when myself and Priti were still in office, we set up a review of the skilled worker visa because we knew things like the salary thresholds were due to be updated,
Yeah.
and there were going to be some changes in the latter part of that year. One of the ones I wanted to do was remove the discount for the shortage occupation list. Again, that always seemed a bit weird that you push wages down and you can recruit more cheaply in jobs that are struggling to recruit. Well, pushing wages down isn't going to encourage more people to do a job. In fact, quite the opposite. And even then, in things like nurse and others, that didn't affect. And there should have been some reforms and changes were due to be brought in late 2022. You'd have to ask Mr. Sunak why he decided not to do that.
Right.
Then in May of the following year, there were some changes around dependence on 1 year graduate routes, visas, student visas. Again, it was minor. I knew Rob had wanted to go a lot further. And it was only then when the net migration figures came out at the back end of 23 that then you saw the rather quite panic. There was then a sort of panic in number 10. And you suddenly saw these announcements come out, which actually have reduced immigration quite significantly, including the bar on dependency for care workers.
And do you think those changes were net positive or net negative?
They needed to happen. I think it was clear there was widespread abuse, and there comes a point where you can't just tinker. You need to act. And the very fact there were more dependents than main visa holders just spoke volumes. There were some particular issues with some sponsors. I think there was one example of one that's sponsoring a Zimbabwean with about 8 dependents. Well, that's clear. You've clearly got to ask some questions there about what was going on, and it was bringing a net negative for the taxpayer overall. But that said, it creates a challenge for the sector that had been recruited. And one of the things, and I've spoken with some in the care sector, is what is the care sector solution to that?
Yeah.
It's all very well standing outside Westminster, waving a placard, demanding dependents are allowed to go on a care worker visa. Well, it clearly didn't work, given what the government did next was to say that they're going to end all recruitment via visas for care workers. What is the sector's solution to those issues? Yep, tougher enforcement, fine. But if it was to be able to take care workers through visas again, how would the sector suggest we deal with those issues? Because if there's no answer, then the Home Office say, well, thanks for your comments, but you've proved my point.
And you think then, how would then the sector suggest those changes? What do you think the sector can do to actually impact, meaningfully the government?
Well, I think what the sector needs to do is, and by the way, there's actually some positives out of this situation as well, which I'll come on to. But I think first the sector needs to be honest with itself about what the problems were. And the problems were large numbers of dependents coming in, looking to access public services, that there were clearly some companies doing large-scale recruitment and potentially not being too bothered about who they were bringing in, some evidence, anecdotal and in particular cases of the fact that perhaps there were payments involved as well. So what can the sector do to set a bar that says, we are only going to be recruiting people who actually have some genuine care skills here that can demonstrate they've got some genuine care skills before they come into this country and are going to be a net positive to the UK and the taxpayer rather than, yes, I'm going to get one care worker and I'm also going to get a large number of dependents, and that care worker after about 3-4 years finds a better job and leaves the care sector. So what is the baseline there? What are the things that can reassure the Home Office that if they were to rig us at any point, is it a cap? Is it a distribution of spaces? The sector needs to perhaps work that through. But there's also a positive for the sector here. It's absolutely obvious that if the government wants to reduce the health and care sector's reliance on immigration, it needs to create more of a domestic supply of workforce and of skills. That then brings to the biggest one for the care sector is sorting out long-term funding. We all know the challenge. We see it in our communities. My father, worked 40 years, labourer patron, Denver doctor, was always quite frugal, always quite economical. Yet in the last 3 years, he's been spending thousands of pounds a month. Has he got a new gambling habit? Taking up with a new partner and loads of holidays? No, he lost the lottery of life. He's got Parkinson's with dementia symptoms. He's now in nursing care. So he gets some great care, by the way. Now, I'd love to thank those who look after him. They do a great job. But it brings home None of us know. Is it me? Is it you? Is it someone watching this? Who's the next person who's going to lose the lottery?
Yeah.
That means they see their entire life's work go in care fees. So that's the first thing, and I think it is persuasive. Second, if we are going to have to tackle all the issues around why people don't don't apply for care worker jobs, but then crucially, it's harder to retain people in care worker jobs. We've got to sort out the funding issue. There's certainly a desire across local government to deal with it, because people will complain about potholes, bins, flowers in the park. But when 70% of your money is being chewed up in social care costs, well, there's not really much flexibility. And I expect many of those reform councillors elected on the 1st of May, probably their jaws dropped when they got the first briefing at their county council that, well, this is how much is spent on social care guys for children and adults. Yeah, but what about potholes? What about this? Yeah, okay, that's here, but this is the big meat of where your money's going. And that's why I think when the government did its immigration statement, what was missing was there should have been 4 statements. And this is where I think the sector can really press home and work with Parliament. The immigration statement on the Monday should have been followed on the Tuesday by a DFE-based statement about skills, about education, about how we're going to meet the proper plan to meet the skills demands of the economy, including in social care. The Wednesday should have been DWP, talking about how will its structures encourage people into some of those roles and vacancies. That's going to involve some tougher stuff. It's easy to announce the nice stuff the day before. The Wednesday would be the tougher stuff. And then on the Thursday should have been bringing forward the Social Care Commission. 2028 is where it's been kicked back to. Yes, we know it's got difficult decisions in it, but you know what? If you're a government with 170 majority, you don't decide, certainly a left-leaning one, and you don't decide to tackle the social care sector issues decisively with that majority. Well, look back to, in the 1940s, the Labour government didn't shy away from tackling what they saw as the issues around expanding universal healthcare and left a big legacy. So this should have been a parliament that would have been able to take a decisive decision on it. But instead, we can now see where the opinion polls are. 2028 to 2029, I'm not going to say it would be any different as a Conservative government. It's hardly the year to be asking MPs, a lot of whom are on quite small majorities, to take a brave decision on social care that they'll probably see the benefit of in about 10, 15 years' time. People in their 40s like me will see the most benefit if we finally resolve these social care issues that are there. But that's not going to be that. So I think this is the one where the care sector can say, okay, you want to reduce our lots of migration. You want me to better recruit more. You want less people to come into care and then move on to something else. Well, that means career paths, that means skills, and that means resolving the long-term funding issues.
And do you think the way to influence that is through local authorities, local government back into central? How do you get them to tackle this big hairy problem that they seem to be kind of shying away from?
Yeah. I think it's the sector setting out how it can deal with it. What does it need? And it's not easy to talk about issues like when do people pay the state levy? Do they pay a bit for life? Do we pay a certain amount over a certain age? None of this is going to be stuff that people are going to thank you for. And we've seen some, all 3 main parties have behaved childishly when previous posts come out. I remember, I think it was Andy Burnham, of all people, wanted to bring a solution through. The Conservative Party had gravestones. When Theresa May wanted to do it, the Labour Party pretended that they could just pay for it all anyway. And the Lib Dems put up a fake estate agent signs, not pointing out to people that actually house can already be lost to social care costs. So the idea that this was new, it's working together, and ultimately it's about with the public having a discussion. I think, the public will understand things. There are people who still think it's all right because the NHS is free. And then when granddad goes into a care home and said, but the NHS is free. And they're told, but this isn't the NHS, this is social care. And you pay for it, unless you've got hardly anything left.
So you see that being like a misnomer within the just wider sphere of public knowledge, thinking that, a care home is almost like publicly funded almost.
If you haven't experienced it,
yeah,
it's sometimes very hard. And one of the things I found the last time we had a really big debate on this about 8 years ago, and again, stupid to do it in the middle of the general election, but I literally have people who would ring me up and say, yeah, but why do you want to now charge for care? Well, that's what happens currently. Yeah, but my dad could only be left with 100,000. No, the current system means he could only be left with 23.
Mm-hmm.
Then meanwhile, but then you had other people. I remember one person emailing me, really angry about the media coverage. Her parents had spent just under £500,000 on care. They'd lost everything. Because as she put it, we went through the money and the savings with domiciliary care for the two of them. Trent, their mum went in the nursing home. Trent, at that time, dad's house was protected. And savings went right down to the minimum, just in time for dad to go in the nursing home. And then on came the house. And we know what comes next. So, that was one person saying, I know what the system is. It's not free. Please tell people to stop in the media reporting this as if it's all free. It isn't. And the way it currently works, as a lot of people watching this podcast will know, a couple can work through their savings at home on domiciliary care costs, and then they deteriorate, they need residential nursing care, they go into that, on comes the house, and the rest is sadly history for too many people. So that's where I think the care sector could be making the case now, not just saying we need a visa, but saying, okay, if that's what people don't want us to be doing, then we really now need to tackle these issues and be and also be prepared to challenge those pretending there's an easy choice. Noticed that Davey this week talking about care, he could make quite a contribution. The problem was when Nick Robinson asked him, well, okay, what would you squeeze or raise in terms of taxes to pay for it? Something about there might be some extra growth. Well, that isn't doing anyone a service.
Interesting. If you were to look kind of forward and you were to say, okay, there is an increase in funding to support the social care sector, how would the social care sector, use that money to increase its domestic staff? Have you got any thoughts on what it could do to actually increase domestic staff coming into the sector?
I think some of it will be around, what's your long-term career plans?
Yeah.
How can people see them starting as a care worker? And a lot of people actually, will look after family members and other things. And, sometimes shifting that perspective that this is what a lot of care work's now about. It's like looking at helping a family member or helping a neighbour. Just doing it on a scheduled basis on several times a day. What's the career path? How can I see myself either flexibly doing work? Because actually one thing care can offer is there's a lot of flexibility around different things. This isn't a 9-to-5 job. That's one of its challenges, but also one of its opportunities. How can I see myself moving on to, for example, get medical qualifications or through the business structure? There's plenty of people who started as a domiciliary care worker now run their own care franchise or company. There are opportunities there, and really trying to break this image that it's about everyone getting minimum wage, being treated badly, and not having any prospects. That sort of narrative. And again, we've also got to watch that some people do it well-meaningly, but if you go in the media and tell everyone basically spend 5 minutes telling everyone why I need a visa because no one want to do this job, British. Well, if you're saying that, anyone listening to that is hardly going to be inspired. I listened to someone talking about why they need a visa and they spent 5 minutes telling me why I don't want to work there. So I think that's something we need to think about, and also how we present the sector. I've met some great representatives like Care England and others.
Yeah.
But when I was immigration minister, the most depressing meeting I ever had was with some representatives of the social care sector. And I thought after 10 minutes of listening to some of these contributions, I'd never want to work in the sector. It just was negative. It was all thinking, okay, but tell me why I should be telling other part. It was just really, I thought, we just need visas. And I thought, no, your visa might help you to a bit, but it's not gonna resolve the issues.
Yeah.
But we could be supporting you in pushing other departments that, come on, we really need to tackle some of the issues here.
So do you think it's then about, care providers in their local government talking to MPs locally to say, like, what solutions can we bring up to central government? Like, how can the care providers work with their local MPs to support and influence?
I'd say the care sector needs to work together, because it's easy to go off and talk to your local MP and them say, oh, absolutely, I completely agree with you. I'll write a letter, I'll sign an EDM. Brilliant. Yeah, marvellous. But there's a bit of a joke in Torbay at the moment about, get the MP to send a letter, that'll sort it out.
Yeah.
The reason it's a joke is because just sending a letter ain't going to change anything. Signing an EDM, great, marvelous.
Yeah.
Really what the sector needs to do is think to itself, how can it work together? How can the representative bodies for the sector work together with providers, with representatives of the local government to try and itself come up with what could the future be? There's models to draw on, places like Germany and other countries. I think if the sector itself started to say, look, do you know what, politicians? You keep on saying you're going to bring something forward, but you never flipping do. And there was going to be a cap, that was kicked back. You said there was going to be a commission this year, that's been booted back. Try and get to a point, because there'll be an appetite, certainly an appetite to do this in local councils. You only got to look at their finances to see why. Work together. What is the care sector solution? Talk to your local MP as part of that, but if this just results in, let's be honest, a couple hundred opposition MPs firing letters into the minister saying, you need to sort this, and a couple of dozen Labour MPs writing in saying, well, I had a very interesting meeting, could the minister please explain what they're doing about this? Well, that's not going to make much of a change at all.
Interesting. How do you think, from a budgetary perspective, local government should, maximise that budget to actually support the social care sector? And how do they kind of bring that to central government to influence the financial decisions to, again, give them more funding locally?
Yeah, I think the local authorities probably already end up maximising a lot of their funding because they are under statutory obligations. They will, there's sharper commissioning than perhaps there was in the past. In the era, I think, of people making 10% return on social care back in the 1980s, anyone watching this will say, what? No, I'm making nothing like that now. I think where local authorities could work with government is one, pointing out, and it's been going on for years now, this is the trajectory. I think there's one trajectory done a few years back of exactly when on certain pressure perspectives and cost projections that councils will be able to afford social care bins, and that's it. So there's a need to, that narrative is there, and I think there is a recognition, certainly West Midlands, there is a recognition that at some point we've got to tackle this. So it's how can councils work with sector to start saying, look, here are some ideas and solutions. You are going to be having to engage with the public about the fact that there isn't a free lunch here. There's not going to be an easy just tax the rich or do it or someone else pays or all this, that and the other. Well, that ain't what's going to happen. You need to look at what is the type of solution. Other countries have moved some of this forward. What is the solution here in the UK to avoid the situation where every year, and people lose everything? We're not talking the wealthiest in society. It's a hit paying for social care, but it's not probably a fundamental one. People who really get whacked are those just above the thresholds. Those people who've worked hard over their career, bought their house, saved up to put their kids to university and everything. Those ones get absolutely whacked and lose everything. And that's what we need to have in mind in this. But that's what I'd say, local councils in the sector, almost saying that, if you can't move a commission forward, if you can't do it yourselves, we'll work on it for you. And come up with clear ideas, but also be prepared as well to say that actually, if someone just wants to do a bit of protest politics and claim it would all be brilliant if just they got in or their demand, well, thank them very much, but say that's not really what we're looking for. We actually, the grown-ups in the room need to try and resolve this. And do you know what? If the Labour government decides to pick it up and do it, good luck to them.
You mentioned, issues in Torby and things like that. Let's say tomorrow you're a care provider and you have these local challenges and you're looking at funding as a way to support the improvement on those challenges. As a care provider, what would you do to influence change? Because I think there's a lot of care providers that would listen to this and think, actually, that is an action plan that I can take, within my organization to influence change. I think part of the problem is people just don't necessarily know where to start, what buttons to press within local and central government to actually influence this change.
Well, with local government, again, let's split out. I think long-term funding has to be done at a national level at the end of the day. We're not going to resolve that council by council, particularly because some of the tax changes are just that would be required are beyond the powers of local councils to implement. Where I think if I was a local provider, one, engaging with the local authority, engaging with the local NHS trust, particularly the NHS trust. And helpfully here in Torbay, there's a shared integrated service.
Right.
So there is a direct correlation between if people are bed blocked. I don't like that term because no one's there just because they want to be there. They won't leave. They're there because they can't leave. Again, there's always been that quite strong. If you're looking to provide things, you're looking to provide options. Virtually every NHS trust in the country will be now. It's warm, it's summer, but they're already starting to plan for winter. What can you do around insisting that people are getting the right care for them at the right time? I.e., there's not 20 people in your local hospital just waiting for a care package, and then people waiting at home on a waiting list who need to be in a hospital bed, but they can't go in because you're there. So that's what I'd say. Local engagement with NHS Trust, making that thing. Second, representative bodies, podcasts, speak out, thinking. What is the difference I can make? Go and talk to your local MB. But I'd always say, and having been there myself, they just say, "I'll send a letter." Fantastic. But then ask them what they're actually going to do. Because what are their thoughts? Are they prepared to get involved if the care sector started to work to try and draw up a plan for itself and how it could resolve proposal and funding? Would they want to be part of that? Would they support it? Or would they see it as a political opportunity to score points at the other side? Great. But that's where things sometimes can go. And as I've already said, no party's been blameless on this one over the last 15, 20 years. But it is becoming all the more urgent that we find a solution for it. And one that at the very least has support of three of the major parties, because people are going to need to know that you and I aren't going to put money aside into a scheme to protect us against social care costs. If my party says it's awful, or if the Lib Dems say they'd scrap it, or Labour says it's all, because we'll sit and think, well, hang on, we're 20, 30 years off. There could be all sorts of combinations of governments over the next 20, 30 years. Why do I want to put money in something that could be scrapped in 10 years' time? So those are the sort of things I'd say with a provider. Talk with your local people, talk with your local trust about probably more short to medium term, but the long-term stuff is going to need to be working with representative bodies about what we can do to make change.
Well, it's quite an interesting point which you raised in regards to almost like the public's perception on contributing to basically the increase in funding that goes back to the social care sector. How would you change that perception of people within Torbay, for example, saying actually you might have to pay a little bit more here, but it will massively impact the lives of everyone in this county and so on and so forth. How would you do that?
Yeah, I think some of it was, I remember when Boris Johnson had a go at it around national insurance, and some of it's around information. The one bonus, some people critique social media, and it's got its problems, but it's also got its opportunities. You can now speak directly to thousands of people locally. We're doing this. I bang out still an email to about 7,500 people locally. Well, the idea that one person could deliver, 7,000 fact sheets a week 30 years ago to have been like, well, how are you going to do that? How do you know what around doing that each week? You publish in the newspaper, those sorts of things. So there is more opportunity to speak, to talk, to be involved. As I said, the recent protest was interesting, but I just looked at it and thought, one of the things we're doing is moaning about dependent visas. There was no, we're highlighting the problem. We know there's a problem. But every MP knows there's a problem. That's not the challenge. It's convincing them that this is the solution, and it's now the time to do it. So I think the public are there. They do see the need. More and more people are being affected by this because more and more people's relatives are getting into the age categories where Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, other things would push them towards care, and are discovering that it is not free at point of need. But it's then how you then relate that to how do we all insure ourselves against the idea that we're going to potentially lose everything. I think that's how in the end it will have to be pitched, is that this is about ensuring that there's 3 of us sat in this room currently. If there was about 4 or 5 of us, we'd know one of us, it would be likely to have that happen to them. And a lot of people prefer insurance, and that's where some of the state, in actual fact, is probably harking back to, of course, go back to the 40s. One of the reasons why the Labour Party called it national insurance, not a welfare tax or whatever, was because of the idea this was insuring you against problems.
Yeah, that's really interesting. One of the last ones in regards to immigration, I just wanted to tackle this. You mentioned indefinite leave to remain, basically, where you have visas that are currently in place with all of these staff that have come from other countries into the UK. You know, you have a turnover of staff both domestically, and then if they get indefinite leave to remain, will we see that turnover of staff, and what will happen to the sector that's currently relying on a lot of international staff? You know, and you can see that there's going to be an issue that's going to take place there. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, it's almost inevitable that once people have wider choices, you need to think about retaining staff as much if they're on a visa as if they're a UK passport holder just walking in the door and getting a job. Anyone, any sector, any employer needs to be thinking about, how do I retain my staff, and not just assume there'll be a ready supply of more people to come on a visa. I remember having quite an interesting discussion at one point with growers not long before the Ukrainian war started, that is it really sensible to be relying on 90% of your workforce to be coming from 3 countries, Belarus, Russia and Ukraine, and all mostly men aged 18 to 40, when we knew the tensions were building up. Apparently I didn't know what I was talking about. Well, we know what came next.
Yeah.
Blocks on young men aged 18 to 40 going off to do seasonal work because both their countries had done other things for them to be doing. Namely, tragically, the fight in Ukraine. So that's probably a very the top end example of being, you can't just assume there'll always be a flow of cheap labor from abroad. So we can't just assume it's there via policy or via reality of global labor markets. So for me, it's, think about your retention. It's exactly the same as retaining any other member of staff. And at some point, again, Labour's talking that the government's talking that they may extend the period to 10 years for those already here. Because that, even if people aren't ILR, they can still switch to other employers in terms of sponsors. Exactly the same as you need to think about retention, because that will also build any case you want to make around immigration. But if people aren't being retained, they're moving off, it just will say to the Home Office and to the government that, well, there's no point. All this will do is just solve a problem from sticky plaster for a year or two, but we'll be straight back to the same problems we had a couple of years ago.
Yeah. And I think, kind of like zooming out and thinking about this whole conversation, there are so many things that both the government can do, the social care sector can do to kind of influence these changes. Either as a summary, kind of the closing remarks, what would you say to government to actually transform the social care sector? Like, how would you summarize all of this?
How I would summarize it is, if you want to remove the sticky plaster of visas and immigration, you need to then apply the main treatment of a proper review of social care. The Commission should not be reporting in 2028. It should be reporting as soon as it can, and take on the discussion about the long-term future of social care, because in reality, immigration cannot be a crutch for a long-term problem that we've known, politically, we've all known has existed for a good 20, 25 years. We've all had various moments when we haven't wanted to solve it, but we now need to. But that's where the sector, I think, could step in and say, if politicians don't want to have this debate, we will, and then see who's prepared to take the decisions to move the whole sector forward.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you very much. Really appreciate the conversation.
No problem at all.
Evan, thank you, buddy.
Good to see you.
Appreciate it. Yeah, thank you.